It was a snowy Friday night in late January of 2022 when John O'Keefe and Karen Red entered the Waterfall Bar and Grill on Washington Street, the main strip in Canton. The couple had just finished up at another popular local bar, and this was their second stop of the night. O'Keefe, a big, brown-haired BPD officer, had been living in Canton since 2014 when his sister died of a brain tumor and her husband died of a heart attack 2 months later, leaving him to raise his niece and nephew. Reed, an equities analyst and adjunct lecturer at Bentley University who was originally from Mansfield but now spent a lot of time at O'Keefe's assisting with the kids, had been his girlfriend for the past 2 years. O'Keefe and Red were already inside the bar when they saw some people they knew sitting at a high-top table close to the stage. Chris Albert, the town selectman who lives next door to O'Keefe, was there, as was his brother, BPD officer Brian Albert, who heads the fugitive apprehension team and was featured on TNT's Boston's Finest, and Brian's sister-in-law, Jennifer McCabe. All were natives of Canton, Massachusetts, a town of 24,000 people in the middle class located about 20 miles south of Boston, where high school and weekend sports are a major part of the social and cultural calendars of many families. As the storm approached that evening, the parents at the pub probably had a good idea that they wouldn't have to drive their kids to their usual Saturday schedule of sporting events. The band set a joyful and celebratory tone for the crowd. O'Keefe guzzled beers, while Red guzzled vodka sodas. When the clock struck 12, almost everyone had to leave. However, the night was far from ended. Brian Albert said he was going home to celebrate his son's birthday by drinking beer with him and invited the others to join him. O'Keefe was hoping to prolong the festivities. Reed, who was weary, intoxicated, and hungry, wasn't as convinced but agreed to drive him anyhow. O'Keefe picked up a cocktail glass on the way out, drank from it, and then took the remaining liquid with him. Leaving footprints in the fresh snow, the couple made their way to Reed's black Lexus SUV and got in. O'Keefe typed the address, 34, Fairview Road, into Waze, and Red got behind the wheel. O'Keefe got out of the car when they pulled up to Albert's house. However, Reed ultimately chose to depart. Reed claims that around 4:30 a.m., while sleeping alone on the couch in O'Keefe's residence, she awoke in the identical clothes she had worn the night before. She looked out the living room window and saw the oncoming nor'easter. O'Keefe was missing while his niece slept upstairs and his nephew had a sleepover. To find out if McCabe had seen O'Keefe, Reed claimed she called her. While Reed did not have her direct line, he was aware that O'Keefe's niece, a close friend of McCabe's daughters, would likely have it. She had no idea where O'Keefe was, so Red roused her up and had her call McCabe, who confirmed Reed's worst fears. McCabe put the receiver down and dialed Chris Albert's wife, Julie, to see whether he had passed out at their house. While this was going on, Reed reached out to O'Keefe's longtime Canton friend Carrie Roberts. Neither of the ladies had run into O'Keefe recently. "Is he okay?" apparently, in the text, she questioned. Following an hour-long search for O'Keefe, Reed, McCabe, and Roberts reunited at McCabe's house before piling into Roberts' car to go in search of O'Keefe. As the women drove through the snowy streets of Canton around morning, Reed cried about her missing partner from the back seat. It was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the instrument panel. Reed screamed that she saw her boyfriend as they pulled up to the house where she had last seen him and jumped out of the car. Even though it was night, she was able to make out O'Keefe's body lying in the snow on the left side of the property at 34 Fairview. Reed went to him, got down on her knees next to him, and hastily dusted the snow off his body. She removed her own shirt and laid on top of him to help him overcome his chill. After running over to where O'Keefe lay, Roberts brushed snow from his face. While Roberts performed chest compressions, Reed began performing mouth-to-mouth CPR on her partner. His right eye was swelled and darkened, and there were bloody marks around his lips and nose. O'Keefe's black Nike sneaker and baseball cap went missing. At 6:04 a.m., McCabe called 911 and hurried over to O'Keefe with blankets from the car to keep her warm. Reed, her boyfriend's blood smeared across her face, yelled out McCabe's and Robert's names over and over as they waited for the ambulance. O'Keefe was transported to Good Samaritan Medical Center in Brockton shortly after the cops arrived. At 7:50 a.m., the doctors confirmed his death. After a few days of investigating, detectives arrested Red on suspicion that she had killed O'Keefe by running over his body with her Lexus. However, that wasn't the final chapter. 1 year later, the court case would explode on local news sites, spark protests, harm reputations, end friendships, and divide the community of Canton, tearing away the social fabric of the once close-knit suburb. Reed stayed on her parents' couch in Dayton for 3 days after discovering O'Keefe dead in the snow, unable to come to terms with what she had witnessed. Where did John go from here? She was asking herself that over and over again. According to Reed, she was devastated by his departure and unable to accept life without him. She dialed the number for her doctor and requested sleep aid. She had also used the internet to find and hire her lawyer, David Unetti. Later, when Canton native and lead investigator for the criminal probe state trooper Michael Proctor and his partner showed up, she cooperated with them. A Chevy Silverado pickup truck was parked in front of Reed's Mansfield home the day she got back from Florida visiting a close friend, according to Reed. She claims that roughly 6 more cars followed shortly after. A police contingent of around a dozen then arrived. Reed was arrested around 7:40 p.m. and taken in handcuffs to the Blue Hill State Police Barracks. After Red spent the night in jail, she was transferred to a holding cell at the Stoughton courthouse. Reed claims that she and Unetti looked over the charges while standing on opposite sides of the prison walls. O'Keefe's right arm had several bloody abrasions. He had 2 black, swollen eyes, a small cut above his right eye, a cut to the left side of his nose, a laceration to the back of his head measuring about 2 inches, and he had multiple skull fractures that had caused bleeding in the brain, as noted by the medical examiner. The deep red color of his pancreatic suggested that hypothermia had played a role in his demise. The rest of the information in the official reports was even more upsetting to Reed. According to witness interviews, Reed had told McCabe she hadn't dropped O'Keefe off at the Post Bar gathering at 34 Fairview, that she had last seen him at the waterfall, and that she and O'Keefe had gotten into a fight. Roberts claims in the charge statement that Red was so inebriated that she informed her the next morning that she couldn't remember anything from the night before, other than wondering if O'Keefe was dead or had been hit by a plow. Roberts also claims that Reed seemed inebriated the next morning. Roberts told police that Red showed them her damaged right taillight and said she didn't know how it happened the night before he, McCabe, and Red found O'Keefe's death. According to the report, when questioned how O'Keefe got his face hurt, Reed told the paramedic, "I hit him. I punched him in the face 3 times." A broken cocktail glass and several spots of blood were also discovered by authorities in the snow close to where O'Keefe's body had been discovered that morning, the report said. 2 pieces of red plastic and 1 piece of clear plastic, all consistent with the shattered taillight on Reed's Lexus, were discovered by the Massachusetts Special Emergency Response Team near the wreckage. Broken glass was found buried in the rear bumper, the right side of the rear tailgate was scratched and dented, and the right side of the rear bumper had 2 scratches and some chipped paint, according to the document detailing the car's seizure. After reviewing the evidence, police and prosecutors decided that Reed was under the influence of alcohol when she rear-ended her boyfriend and drove off. A bailiff arrived to get Red from the holding cell as soon as she and her lawyer finished reading the evidence against her. She claims he took her into Stoughton District Court with wide eyes and fear in her heart. Inside the courtroom were O'Keefe's family, friends, and co-workers from the Boston Police Department, including the uniformed BPD Superintendent-in-Chief Gregory Long. While her daughter was being arraigned on manslaughter charges, Reed's mother prayed on the other side of the aisle. Reed then stated her plea of innocence. While speaking to media outside the courthouse, Unetti explained that his client was in a state of shock and that O'Keefe's death was an accident. There was no criminal intent, Reed claimed. She had fallen deeply in love with him. She's in utter despair. An altogether darker interpretation of the events quickly gained traction. Yannetti claims he contacted a tipster who had called his office on his way home from the arraignment. According to what Yannetti remembers, a man with a gravelly voice answered the phone and said something to the effect of, "Your client is innocent." Brian Albert and his nephew brutally assaulted John. They broke his nose, and when O'Keefe didn't come to, Brian and a federal agent dumped his body on the front lawn. Yannetti was at a loss for words. How likely was that? He recalled the guests from that evening's after-party, recalling that the host, Brian Albert, was a well-known Boston police officer. In addition to O'Keefe and Reed, there was a federal law enforcement officer present at 34 Fairview that night, Special Agent Brian Higgins from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. According to Yannetti and Reed, the additional details led them to suspect that Reed was being set up. A private investigator was engaged to go door-to-door in Canton. In Canton, O'Keefe and Reed's mutual acquaintance Tom Beatty provided additional information. His daughter knew Brian Albert's nephew Colin Albert, and Colin said that he had been at 34 Fairview Road the night O'Keefe died. A night in the spring of 2020, when O'Keefe's home security alarm went off and he sprung out of bed, is what Reed recalls thinking about when she heard the news. She claims to have remembered seeing Colin Albert with a group of teenagers in the front yard after she followed him down the stairs. Reed recalled Colin shouting, "Go fuck yourself," at O'Keefe. She remembered her lover saying, "Get the fuck out of here," and she took that to mean exactly what it meant. Reed claims that the couple discovered a dozen empty Bud Light cans in the yard the following morning. Even though she claims that the police were never contacted, the tension between Colin and O'Keefe only grew from that point on. She now elaborates that O'Keefe only had problems with Colin. Reed claims that when she and her father, William, visited with Yannetti in his office, another apparent clue in the case quickly came after they learned that Colin Albert had been present at 34 Fairview. Reed was shown images of O'Keefe's body by the police for the first time. She remembers feeling so overwhelmed that she had to wait until the elevator returned to the foyer before she could finally let loose with a flood of tears. She said he appeared to have been beaten the shit out of. Reed contacted her mother as she and her father drove home on Route 93 to tell her about O'Keefe's strange arm injuries. Her mother speculated that perhaps they belonged to a wild animal. Read the book by Beatty. The Alberts, do they have a dog? She inquired. Certainly, he said, a German Shepherd. Reed then recounts how, 3 months later, a couple with whom he and O'Keefe had become friendly invited themselves over to his place for dinner. The morning of O'Keefe's death, they and others who appeared in Reed's call log testified before the grand jury in the case. State Trooper Michael Proctor, a Canton resident and the case's lead detective, had mentioned that he had known members of the Albert family for years while they were eating Italian takeout at Reed's mahogany dining room table, next to a sideboard crowded with pictures of Reed and O'Keefe, one with a rosary draped across it. That sounded like a potential conflict of interest to Reed. After her visitors had left, she returned to her bedroom, where she placed her laptop up on the pillows of her humongous white bed and began perusing Proctor's public Facebook page. Reed claimed she then went to Proctor's sister's account and looked through 1,300 images there. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she unearthed the photo she'd been searching for, which had been taken at Proctor's sister's wedding and included a young Colin Albert as the ring bearer. After that, Reed came upon a second photo of Proctor's parents and sister with Chris Albert's relatives. No words could come out of Reed's mouth. She claims that as she sat on her bed contemplating the murder of O'Keefe, a theory emerged in her head that would ultimately prove her innocence. According to her account of events, tensions between Colin and other household members served as fuel for an in-house brawl later that evening. The German Shepherd belonging to the Alberts also leapt in, which could account for the family's strange arm injuries. The revelers eventually left O'Keefe outside to freeze to death. Reed was already convinced that she was being framed thanks to the tipster's information, but she had wondered who was really in charge. According to Reed, it was at this point that she realized Proctor was the key. Meanwhile, the prosecution has not abandoned its conviction that Reed is responsible for O'Keefe's death. The grand jury decided there was enough evidence to also charge her with second-degree murder, suggesting she had purposefully slain O'Keefe after reviewing the prosecutor's case. On June 9, Proctor and 3 other policemen came to Reed's house to make another arrest. Reed was now in risk of receiving a life sentence. She went home to take a long, hot shower after posting bail, which was set at $100,000. "This is actually happening," she told herself. The stakes were constantly increasing. Bigger, legally obtained firearms were what she needed, and she knew it. Reed sat at her computer, her fingers hesitating over the keys. 2 months later, she was writing an email to Alan Jackson, a prominent Los Angeles criminal defense attorney who had represented such high-profile clients as Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, and she wanted the subject line to capture his attention. It read, "Murder of a Boston Cop," typed by her. The plan was successful. After Jackson had received O'Keefe's autopsy through email, Reed, her father, and Yannetti all joined a conference call to discuss the findings. Jackson jumped in while Yannetti was summarizing the evidence, asking, "How the fuck are they saying he got these injuries?" O'Keefe's blackened, puffy eyes and the gashes on his arm made it look like Reed's boyfriend had been attacked by a dog rather than run over by a car. Reed's attorneys also noticed that the lead detective said he arrived at Reed's parents' house in Dighton at 4:30 p.m. In the original affidavit he filed in February, 6 months prior, and had her vehicle removed around 5:30 p.m., but the surveillance footage from the Reed's house, as well as the Dighton police report, proved that the correct time was closer to 4:12 p.m. According to Reed and her lawyers, Proctor had 78 extra minutes to break Reed's taillight and hide the shards at 34 Fairview before the CERT team arrived at 5:45 p.m. Jackson joined the defense team officially and started seeking for evidence that supported their new theory and cleared Reed of wrongdoing. They discovered odd behavior, such Brian Albert selling his house and getting rid of his dog after O'Keefe's death. McCabe voluntarily handed over her phone to the prosecution in February, but it wasn't until early March that they discovered what they believed a bombshell, a damning Google search. McCabe, as shown by the data, apparently Googled the phrase "hose long to die in cold" at 2:27 a.m. the evening of O'Keefe's murder. The 3 women didn't come across O'Keefe in the snow for several hours. The exact identical query was performed once more at 6:23 a.m. McCabe claims that Red asked her to look for it at 6:24 a.m. Jackson filed a 92-page document with the court on April 12 of this year, outlining the defense team's theory. Legal representation for Reed would have been more effective if the media had paid attention to their contention that there was more to the story than initially seemed. Their request was granted 5 days later. Aidan Kearney, aka Turtleboy, a blogger, sat down in his Holden house surrounded by the plastic toys and board games of his young children and looked through the case documents after receiving many news reports telling him to research the O'Keefe murder. Kearney, the divisive figure behind TB Daily News, claims he understood instantly that this was the kind of story his ardent followers would enjoy. Kearney stayed up until 3 a.m. working on his article. Publication with the heading Canton Cover-Up, Part 1, Corrupt State Trooper Helps Boston Cop Cover-Up Murder of Fellow Officer, Frame Innocent Girlfriend. Kearney's account outlined the argument given by Reed's attorneys to the court, in which McCabe instilled the idea in Reed's head that she might have unintentionally ran over O'Keefe, and in which Proctor was supposed to have planted fragments of Reed's taillight at the site. Kearney came to the conclusion that Karen Reed was innocent of the murder accusation against her because corrupt cops would see her rot in prison in order to cover up a murder of a fellow officer. Kearney anticipated his article's instant virality after publication. Indeed, he was correct. He claims that an overwhelming amount of traffic nearly brought down his website. While all was going on, back in Canton, the media storm was on the verge of splitting the city in two. The next day, rumors of a suspected conspiracy could be heard all around town, from the Shaw's Deli to the Brookmeadow Country Club golf course. Prior to Kearney's article, few people outside of close circles knew of O'Keefe's passing. It became the hot topic overnight, and people quickly took sides. The town's police had released a statement asking for calm, saying, "Have heard the same sensational accounts as our townsfolk." Head Helena Rafferty was responsible for writing the statement. To paraphrase, unlike defense attorneys, prosecutors and police are ethically constrained to what can be said outside of the courtroom. Kearney did not have any such limitations. His monthly page visits increased from roughly 1.5 million to as much as 4 million as he continued to write on the case. When he started airing Canton cover-up episodes live on YouTube twice a week, he saw an increase in views from 3,000 to 20,000. 2 weeks later, when Reed and her legal team finally appeared in court, the public mood had shifted in her favor. Outside the courthouse, many people were congregating. The crowd yelled, "Go get M, Karen," and another person added, "Stand tall, girl, stand tall," as Jackson recalled. Astonished, Reed looked to her legal counsel. The audience cheered as they left the courtroom. At this point, Jackson stood up and presented the defense's alternate argument, which was precisely what Kearney had posted. The witnesses in the case, those inside the house that night, had hidden evidence of the horrible events that transpired inside the home, resulting to O'Keefe's murder. Their mutual law enforcement acquaintance, Michael Proctor, then aided in covering up the crime and framing O'Keefe's girlfriend. Prosecutors countered the defense's theory with their own proof that Reed was guilty. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the citizens of the town were at war with one another. Parents who used to sit together at high school sports now look away and remain mute whenever someone with a different opinion passes by. The woman said, "My social group is really small right now because of this," adding that she, like many Canton residents, wished not to be identified for fear of repercussions in her area. One Canton native adds, "It's like bringing up Donald Trump at a dinner party, and she has since limited her social circle to those she can trust." It may very well detonate. Most people would want it not be known publicly which side they are on. They don't want to cope with the repercussions, therefore they don't do it. However, in a community where many families had resided for generations, the fault lines sometimes took the shape of old grudges. "The problem with this town is that nobody fucking leaves," one inhabitant has said. Most people in Canton are turning on each other for silly reasons like jealousy of Jen from high school or hatred of the Albert family or anger that Chris Albert was elected to the select board. We still have grudges against them from high school. At the same time, at the real school, students began attacking one another. One father, who believes Karen and her friend's parents don't, says his daughter was expelled from her friend group and his other daughter became borderline suicidal because of this disagreement. Kearney's prominence in the tabloid drama grew as the case progressed. He joined the Facebook group Justice for John O'Keefe and Karen Redd, a place where more than 21,000 people argue about the finer points of the case, attack individual witnesses, and resort to hyperbolic insults to one another. In retaliation, according to both parties, the people Kearney claims were responsible for O'Keefe's death on the night he was found dead at 34 Fairview, along with O'Keefe's loved ones, formed a separate private group, the administrator of which was a former Kearney contributor who had a falling out with him over the course of several years. Since then, the two have been at each other's throats in a legal dispute. While Kearney calls himself a journalist, he doesn't rely on written or visual media to convey his case. He has also taken his audience on trips to Canton and further afield in an effort to meet with those he holds accountable for O'Keefe's death. For instance, Kearney filmed and live-streamed a conflict he had with McCabe's daughter at a high school lacrosse game in Billerica, which was open to the public. "Did you really believe you could fool Karen Reed?" As McCabe sat with her teen daughter and her friends, she did her best to ignore him and his question. "Are you concerned about your loved one's well-being if you end yourself in jail?" His audience has even gone as far as encouraging McCabe to terminate her own life via text and Facebook messaging. Perhaps the most severe hostility was directed at O'Keefe's family, particularly his brother Paul and his mother Peg, who has lost 2 of her 3 children, John and his sister. According to statements made by Kearney on his YouTube program, with the O'Keefes, enough of the fucking pity party for these fucking people, and the only good part about John not being alive is that he doesn't have to be around you useless maggots for a second more, are both examples of his disdain for the O'Keefe family. Screw you. Stop acting so superior. Kearney says it offends him that they think the state is prosecuting the correct person, and he's happy to be able to use his position to bring attention to the issue. Because of his alter ego, Turtleboy, the beauty of Turtleboy is that I can do things in an unconventional manner that other journalists are restricted from doing, he explains. I thrive in the spotlight and enjoy acting and putting on shows. I was born to do this. On July 22nd, Kearney and a crowd of over 100 Norwood residents, from bearded grandfathers to infants in car seats, assembled in the parking lot of a Shaw's Grocery to demonstrate their support for his argument. A pun on McCabe's erroneous Google query. Then, while Turtleboy fans watched online, approximately 50 vehicles set off on a rally through the streets of Canton. During the next 2 hours, Kearney visited the residences of Brian Albert, Michael Proctor, and Jennifer McCabe in his brand new Lexus. Kearney used a bullhorn to announce each stop and accused the people there of being complicit in O'Keefe's murder cover-up. At the Canton Police Department, the event came to a close. Vehicles driving by honked their horns in solidarity. Someone in a passing car threw an egg at the demonstrators from the window. A few days later, Kearney arrived in style, shouting into a bullhorn while wearing a gray hose long to die in cold t-shirt in front of the Dedham courthouse, where 100 or so people had been loudly protesting for nearly 2 hours under the blazing sun, holding homemade signs emblazoned with "DA Stop Lying" and "Way Beyond Reasonable Doubt." The driver's presence near the passenger door calmed the normally rowdy crowd, increasing the tension even further. He unlocked the door and Jackson, dressed impeccably, emerged. When Red came out wearing a sleek black suit dress and heels, he turned and extended his hand. She looked around at the onlookers and beamed as she made her way through the throng and up the stairs of the courthouse. As they passed by people wearing Free Karen Red t-shirts, the crowd began to boo O'Keefe's parents, who responded by lowering their heads. As soon as the courtroom's upper doors opened, onlookers filed in, filling the benches on both sides of the gallery. O'Keefe's loved ones, many of whom wore Justice for J.J. buttons, sat across from Reed's supporters. While Reed and her 4 attorneys sat calmly at the defense table, Assistant District Attorney Adam Lally entered the room, red in the face and carrying a huge stack of documents. Lally argued several motions asking the judge to order Reed and her lawyers to turn over her cell phone data to the prosecution. Reed had called her lawyer Yannetti a few hours after O'Keefe's death, and even though the state police had taken her phone into custody 18 months prior, prosecutors had been barred from examining its contents due to the presence of privileged communication. The prosecution's interest in Reed's cell phone records is understandable. After all, it might indicate the people she spoke with and texted that night, as well as her whereabouts in the hours before she phoned McCabe the next morning. This is crucial since the prosecution claims that 15 incidents occurred in front of O'Keefe's Ring cameras between 6 p.m. and midnight. Between 6 a.m. on the morning of his death and the previous night. The following morning, but there is no footage of Red getting back to his house late the night before. Reed was seen driving toward the waterfall at 5:11 a.m. and then away from the waterfall at 5:15 a.m., which may be explained by data in her phone. In the direction of 34 Fairview Street and finally ending up at McCabe's that morning. What was she doing there, and had she already located O'Keefe's corpse? Considering the police officer who arrived in response to the 911 call had to use the spotlight on his car to see the women who were kneeling over O'Keefe's body, this could be the explanation for how she managed to find him in the dark. However, Reed's alternate explanation still has several potential flaws, even without the missing cell phone data. The argument that O'Keefe was assaulted inside 34 Fairview, for example, is predicated on O'Keefe and Colin Albert's purportedly tense relationship. Colin Albert, however, revealed to Boston in an exclusive interview that he left 34 Fairview Street just as Brian Albert was arriving, said hello, and got into the car of Jennifer McCabe's daughter, who drove him home. There was apparently no one else there at the time, not even O'Keefe, as evidenced by the court papers. Boston has seen his parents' texts confirming he was picked up at 12:10 a.m., and they say he stayed at home the rest of the night, disproving the theory that O'Keefe was killed inside the house mere minutes after his arrival due to his hatred of Colin, and that his friends then dumped his body onto the lawn in the snow to freeze to death. Reed's other argument is also undermined by the fact that, according to many Canton residents who knew both O'Keefe and Colin, the alleged animosity between them never existed. Furthermore, two sources allege that another youngster, not Colin, was involved in the conflict between O'Keefe and the rowdy beer-drinking teens on his lawn that Reed remembers. Also, a source familiar with the case claims that Brian Albert had already contacted a real estate agent about selling his house before the night O'Keefe was killed, dispelling any concerns that his actions on those days were related to the murder. Reed's attorneys claim that investigator Proctor planted evidence at the crime scene, although the prosecution has found several inconsistencies in this claim. The DA's office claims the mistaken time listed in Proctor's police report was an oversight that was corrected in later filings, disproving his claim that he had ample time to plant evidence. Proctor was never alone in Reed's Lexus and never went back to 34 Fairview after it was taken, as confirmed by police reports, and the DA Reed's defense has an even bigger difficulty with the evidence that tiny shards of taillight plastic were found on O'Keefe's shirt. According to the state's own forensic specialists, McCabe's search for "how long does it take to die in the cold" on Google shows that he was looking for an answer at 2:27 a.m. occurred when McCabe typed a query into the browser's search field at 2:27 a.m. and unclosed, so it does not indicate that the search was conducted at that time. Other parts of Reed's defense have been called into question by forensic evidence. The prosecution claims the medical examiner stated before the grand jury that O'Keefe's injuries were not the product of a struggle, but rather were abrasions brought on by blunt force trauma, as detailed in the court filings. The state also obtained information from Reed's Lexus indicating that she was traveling backwards at a high rate of speed when her vehicle struck and dragged the victim before speeding away from the scene. Reed's lawyers will have to explain not only the physical evidence, but also Reed's shifting story. Prosecutors claim that O'Keefe's niece, who Red awakened up to call McCabe, testified that Red lied to McCabe many times during their conversation that morning. It was still changing, too. Reed claimed to Proctor that she had a stomachache after dropping off O'Keefe at Fairview and that she did not see him return home. She told Boston she saw O'Keefe rush up to the home and enter via the entrance of the breezeway, that she waited about 10 minutes to hear from him, that it was copacetic for her to join him and his buddies, and that she departed when he didn't answer her calls or come back. Reed's group's theory relies on O'Keefe being inside the residence. Data from O'Keefe's phone, which was located on the ground next to his body, indicates it never left the yard, according to a statement released by Norfolk District Attorney Michael Morrissey. Red has maintained that she and O'Keefe were in a love relationship, but the prosecution claims that O'Keefe's phone indicates that Reed contacted him 50 times that night, leaving angry voicemails and shouting that she despised him. Another potential bombshell concerns ATF agent Higgins, who was also in the Fairview residence that night, and is buried in the paperwork. Many in Canton said he hasn't been heard from since O'Keefe's death night, and he was the only one present who hasn't been the center of Turtleboy coverage. A person familiar with the texts has described some of them as romantic in nature, and he voluntarily handed over his phone to the authorities so they could read them. The fact that the trial is scheduled for March 12, 2024, and that the prosecution has evidence they haven't publicly shared and likely won't release until then, is not taken into account. Reed's defense team is asking the jury to believe that O'Keefe's then 14-year-old niece and a childhood friend of Reed's who didn't know any of the people the conspiracy is allegedly protecting conspired to frame Red. This includes officers from multiple law enforcement agencies, an emergency responder, several witnesses, a medical examiner, forensic computer experts, and Red himself. They need only raise a reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case. This could be the key to Reed's release. The trial hasn't even started yet, and it's already making the rounds in Hollywood. Reed has been filmed by Dateline for an upcoming episode that will air after the judgment, and Kearney claims that other documentary filmmakers, including several from Netflix, have sought him to interview him. In the meantime, the tabloid drama has Canton residents in a state of convulsion. On August 8, Canton residents crowded the second floor of Memorial Hall to voice their displeasure with Selectman Chris Albert, the Canton Police Department, and the media's portrayal of their normally tranquil suburb as a national disgrace. Police Chief Rafferty spoke up, saying that she understood the public's curiosity about the O'Keefe case given the scant details that had been made public, but that it was unacceptable for residents who had not been accused of any wrongdoing in the case to be bullied and harassed by either side under the guise of the First Amendment. After waiting a few weeks, Norfolk DA Morrissey sent a video recording of his follow-up. He sat in front of a bookcase full of legal texts and pleaded with the public to stop bothering the crime witnesses by mentioning material that challenges much of Reed's alternative theory. "We try people in the court and not on the internet for a reason," he adding that this was the first and only occasion in his career that he had ever been forced to record such a message. "There are no standards of proof on the internet. Perjury on the internet goes unpunished. And you can't trust everything you read online." A few weeks later, during a regularly scheduled select board session in town, a person cried into the microphone. "It's been a long 19 months, she said, adding that she hoped an independent investigation would help her town heal the rift caused by the crime. O'Keefe was a decent man and a kind person who, after losing his sister, took on the responsibility of raising her children with love and devotion, and this is something on which nearly everyone in Canton can agree. His unexpected death has sown discord in a town where he was well-liked. People in Canton are currently preoccupied with determining whether Reed is a criminal or a victim of police corruption, so O'Keefe isn't getting much attention.